So we have completed another Souls marathon, this time beating all of the games using the Guts' Greatsword. If you don't know who Guts is, this is a character from the anime or manga Berserk, and Berserk served as a very heavy inspiration to the Souls games. There are plenty of references, and the sword of which the protagonist uses is just one of them. Now there are only going to be 4 Guts' Greatswords in these games. I could potentially go ahead and include more, like the Crypt Black Sword from Dark Souls 2, it looks very similar to the Dragon Slayer, as does Ludwig's Holy Blade from Bloodborne. Even the Royal Greatsword from Elden Ring actually kind of looks like the first weapon that Guts uses. But if I include those ones, then I'm going to end up down this massive rabbit hole, trying to find all the weapons that kind of look like the Guts' Greatsword, and then this video will just lose all meaning. So we're not going to do that, and we're just going to talk about these 4 today, which yes, it is going to be a shorter type of video. And as always, the criteria for this video is going to be based on how well the weapon performs inside of its own game. But yeah, with that out the way, let's just get into it. Starting off at the bottom, we have the Dark Souls 3 Greatsword. Now this is perfectly serviceable as an Ultra Greatsword in this game. It gets some of the most range, it can get some of the most damage. Its charged heavy attack can send enemies flying. Its weapon art in Stomp can give you a whole bunch of hype armor, you can tank a bunch of attacks, and you can trade out pretty nicely. You can also get the weapon very early on in the game without having to farm. But my main problem with this weapon is going to come from the fact that it's just outclassed by a lot of the other Ultra Greatswords in this game. The Lothric Knight Greatsword can just output more damage and have the better moveset. Weapons like the Profaned Greatsword and the Astoria's Greatsword just get the much better weapon art. Something like the Zweihander doesn't really get that much less damage, but it just weighs way less, which that's another thing. This is actually the second heaviest Ultra Greatsword in the entire game, weighing in at 20 units, means that you have to actually spec into a decent amount of vitality, which is something you don't really have to do if you have a lighter weapon, because in this game, equipment load is not tied to endurance, but you're still going to have to spec into endurance anyway, because the stamina cost of the Greatsword is a lot higher than some of the other Ultra Greatswords in this game, especially with its weapon art, Stomp, which Stomp is actually pretty good, but this weapon actually has the worst version of it because it actually does the horizontal swipe instead, which consumes a lot of stamina. It's going to have a longer animation than like the upward cut that you can get with the Zweihander. And also, I already get the option of being able to hit an enemy with a horizontal swipe and send them flying with my 2-handed charged heavy. This also does the exact same thing. So it kind of doesn't really have much in terms of variety of moveset. But speaking of the moveset, in Dark Souls 3 Ultra Greatsword movesets do get those nice vertical chops, which honestly, this is like very solely missed in my opinion. I wish they actually bring this back for Elden Ring. Just having a big ass weapon with nice vertical chops is pretty nice because it actually does get a cool backward swing, and on the way back it actually also gets a hitbox. Now unlike in Dark Souls 2, that little backward swing actually does consume an additional stamina, but there are circumstances of which you can just do bonus damage against enemies. So yeah, Ultra Greatswords can be very viable in this game, and this one did make my playthrough very easy, but obviously we're comparing this to all the other Greatswords, which every single one of these Greatswords are just amazing weapons, so I'm going to have to be critical. But if you were to use this weapon, you won't have any problems because it is really good. Number 3, we have the Dark Souls 1 variant of the Greatsword. Now, this Greatsword is obviously looking a lot skinnier than probably what you're used to compared to all the other ones. It's probably more comparable to what Guts used in the Golden Age arc, has like a smaller weapon, but obviously it still fits the theme. Now, as for the weapon itself, it is going to be an Ultra Greatsword still, and honestly, it actually is one of the best weapons in the entire game. It is very comparable to the Zweihander, and if you checked out my top 10 best Dark Souls 1 video, you'll know how much I actually value the Zweihander. But both of these weapons get the exact same base damage and they get the exact same scalings. So it doesn't matter what level, what infusion, both of these things are going to be outputting the exact same amount of damage. But the differences being, and the reason why the Zweihander is probably used more than the Greatsword, is because the Zweihander gets more range, has lower requirements, weighs less, and you can get it right at the beginning of the game. But that's not to say that the Greatsword doesn't have any specific uses, because its moveset is slightly different. The light attacks, running attack, rolling attack, they're all exactly the same. It's just the heavy attack that is going to be different. With the Greatsword, you actually get a poking attack with the heavy, whereas a Zweihander, you get some downward slam, which both of these are perfectly fine. It doesn't actually add more variety one way or the other, because you already get vertical swipes with your running attack, and you already get a poking attack with your roll. But with that being said, poking attacks are just always going to be doing more damage because counter attacks exist, so hitting while an enemy is also attacking you can just result in more damage, and pair this alongside the Leo ring, you can just output even more damage. However, there's going to be a reason why people still would probably want to use the Zweihander over these amazing poking attacks, and that's because the Zweihander heavy attack gets a very special effect, and that it just pancakes enemies to the ground, of which they're just vulnerable to even more attacks, so it can definitely trivialize a lot of encounters, where the Greatsword doesn't get an effect like this. The poking attack doesn't send enemies flying or anything like that. It's just going to result in just more damage. So both weapons are obviously really amazing. It's kind of just picking and choosing what you really want to use the weapon for. If you're just going to value damage in just the boss fights, then the Greatsword is probably going to be the better option because those heavy attacks can output a lot. But if you're going to value more poise damage and value your experiences between the bosses, then the Zweihander is just going to be the better option. So honestly, I would like to put the Greatsword higher on the list, but being that the Zweihander kind of outclasses it in a lot of areas, it can only get number 3. If the Zweihander didn't exist, this one would honestly get number 1. Number 2, we have the Dark Souls 2 Greatsword, and this one is going to be a lot fatter than what you get with your Dark Souls 1 counterpart. I don't know why they decided to make it so fat, but thankfully it's really good. This is basically everything that you need in an Ultra Greatsword. You can get it very early on in the game. You can actually purchase an infinite amount of them very early on too. It gets some of the most range in the class, gets a second highest base damage, it gets an S scaling in strength, gets 130 counter damage. It also doesn't weigh as much as some of the other Ultra Greatswords, and it also gets some of the lowest requirements too. So yeah, needless to say, this is just an incredible weapon to have. In terms of its moveset, the one-handed attacks are just going to be nice horizontal swipes. The two-handed attack is going to be those vertical chops, which I talked about it in Dark Souls 3 and how much I like them, but in this game, I can't really say the same thing. With how annoying it is to try and track and redirect your attacks in this game, these vertical swipes just did not make for that fun of an experience. I missed like so many times with this thing, it's not even funny. Which probably was like a little bit of a skill issue, but it doesn't change the fact that tracking in this game is just completely shit, except to when it actually comes with the rolling attack. The two-handed rolling attack is a very nice poke, it's very quick, and the tracking is actually pretty decent. And the best thing about this poking attack, obviously outside of the fact that it's doing this thrusting damage, but also combos with a light attack so well. The whole combo is just so fast, and also doesn't consume much stamina as well. It could definitely output some of the highest burst damage in the entire game. Now there are going to be some unfortunate things about its movesets. The running attack and the heavy attack I just thoroughly despise. They do this like terrible like diagonal swipe that hits basically nothing, has way too long of an animation. The recovery frames are way too long to where you're just guaranteed to get hit like every single time, and the damage isn't even that good either. But thankfully the light attacks and the rolling attack is just more than enough to make up for it. And also, this is Dark Souls 2, so we can power stance as well. And as I mentioned earlier, you can just buy multiple of these very early on in the game, and combined with its very low requirements for an Ultra Greatsword, it can definitely be one of the better power stancing options. Now obviously it is going to be pretty heavy, so you have to spec into a lot of vitality, which I just hate vitality as a stat. Thank God they actually brought back equipment load tied to endurance. But the power sensing combo is actually really good. The R1 into L1 combo just made for such very quick follow-up attacks. And then spamming this the entire time just shredded all the bosses in the game. Even the DLC ones just did not stand a chance. And the fact that all these Ultra Greatswords get 130 counter damage means that if you want to trade out, it could just be even better and even more damage. So yeah, overall my Greatsword experience in Dark Souls 2 was a very good one, and they definitely make for one of the best Ultra Greatswords in this game. Now, as for number 1, we are going to have the Elden Ring Greatsword. Now, this weapon actually takes more of a form of what Guts uses towards the later chapters. It is going to be a lot larger of a weapon compared to what he had, but this weapon is going to be a Colossal Sword, and Colossal Swords are an amazing weapon class. They get really nice range, solid damage, good variation in moveset. Now yes, its two-handed attacks aren't going to do those cool vertical swipes that you get in Dark Souls 2 and 3. Hopefully they do bring back that moveset, but if you did want some type of verticality, you could just use a jumping attack. But yeah, one-handed and two-handed light attack combos are just going to do nothing but horizontal swipes. But arguably the best part about its moveset is going to be the rolling and crouching attack, because it's going to be a quick poke, which the rolling poke is very similar to what you get in Dark Souls 2 and 1. But the fact that you actually get a crouching poke means you actually can get access to poking very quickly without having to use much stamina. And obviously the poking attacks are going to be doing piercing damage, and piercing damage in this game is amazing because a lot of enemies are weaker to it, and obviously counterattack damage exists. It can be boosted with the Spear Talisman to further improve the damage. But the best thing about Colossal Swords are probably going to be its Ash of War options. Despite them being really large swords, they actually get some pretty decent options. You get a very solid projectile attack in Vacuum Slice, and if you want a very hard-hitting close range option, then Giant Hunt or Lion's Claw are just going to be for you. These things can just output so much damage and do really good stance damage too for not consuming much FP, which these 3 Ashes of War are actually best paired with the Greatsword. Out of all the weapons in the game, if you want to use those 3 skills, the Greatsword is probably going to be the best one, because compared to all the other Colossal Swords, it gets the most range and it gets the most damage. And being that the meta in this game is just going to be L2 or weapon skill spam, It just makes the Greatsword one of the best L2 spamming tools, which essentially means it's going to be one of the better weapons in the game. Just having something like Lion's Claw can just trivialize the entire game, because it lunges pretty far, you get infinite hyper armor, so you're never going to get staggered out of it, you do more stance damage than a fully charged heavy attack, and it only consumes 20 FP. And honestly, in my opinion, I think Giant's Hunt can perform even better than that. You can output more damage, you're doing piercing damage, it's a quicker animation, it consumes less FP, and you do like this cool crouching animation to where a lot of attacks can probably go over your head. And you can just like yeet enemies up into the air. So using either one of these skills can just make this weapon just be absolutely incredible. But to talk about the weapon itself, it doesn't have that high of a requirement compared to some of the other Colossal Swords, but it does actually tie for the heaviest Colossal Sword. Its moveset is very similar to all the other Colossal Swords except for its heavy attack, which its heavy attack is just going to be like another horizontal swipe, which is not too bad, but the fact that you already get horizontal swipes with your light attack combo, it's not going to be that useful. This right-hander heavy with its poking attack is just going to be way better. But if this thing did have a poking heavy attack, then it would just make all the other Colossal Swords just incredibly useless. And another cool thing about this weapon, actually does double down nicely as a shield. So if you actually wanted to save on equipment load and not actually use a shield, you could just block with this weapon and actually wouldn't even be that bad. You get the highest damage negation and the highest stability compared to all the other Colossal Swords in the game. Now obviously you're still going to be taking some chip damage, but being able to block 84% of physical damage with the stability of a medium shield is actually pretty good. So yeah, the Elden Ring Greatsword is just going to be one of the best weapons in the entire game with very little downsides. Anyway, that concludes the list. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below, and do like and subscribe. The next marathon that I actually am going to end up doing is going to be a Scythe marathon. So definitely do check me out on Twitch for that, and do look forward to me ranking all of the scythes from worst to best across all the games. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.